This is the third video in a four-part series on building a top headlines app using SwiftUI. And in this video, we'll be introducing iOS 15. We're going to start the video by also introducing source control, so that when we start developing in iOS 15, we'll be on a development branch, and then have the ability to roll back if we need to. We'll then conditionally introduce iOS 15 APIs while still supporting iOS 14. And this will introduce the new task method. We'll introduce AsyncImage to asynchronously fetch and download our images, and also AsyncAwait as the new way to execute asynchronous code. We'll also get introduced to the main actor. Now, before I get started, let me request that if you enjoy this video, please leave a comment below and give it a thumbs up, and then subscribe to my channel. Make sure you ring the bell to be notified of new videos. And if you want to support my work, you can buy me a coffee. If this is something you want to learn, then keep watching. Now, if you've followed along with this project from the beginning, you can continue using the same project code. Or you can download the starter project from the link in the notes below, and that's the completed project from video 2. Just make sure that you follow the initial steps in the very first video to secure your own newsapi.org's API key. In this part of the series, I'm going to be looking at how we might add some new features for iOS 15 for those that have upgraded, yet still maintain backwards compatibility, albeit somewhat limited, access for those who have not yet updated their OS. Let's assume that we've released our app to the App Store, and the target, as you can see now, is iOS 14.5. At the time of this video, iOS 15 is still in beta, but it will be released in the fall of 2021, and I want to get a head start so that I can update the app on day one. So let's start working on adding some iOS 15 features for those that want to get started with that. Before I jump into that, however, I want to add source control and create a new development branch. I do not yet have any source control enabled for this app, so I'm going to use Xcode's source control menu to create a new Git repository. And this creates the repository and automatically commits all your files to the repo. Next, I'm going to go to the source control navigator and expand this tree to see the branches, and I currently have one branch, and it's called main, and it's the current one. If I right-click on the branch, I can choose branch from main. I'm going to call the new branch development, and you can see it not only creates that branch, but also checks it out and makes it the current one. With this still being iOS 14, let's check out the main branch one more time. You can exit Xcode 12 now, but to continue on with this series, you're going to need a copy of Xcode 13. You don't really at this point have to know anything about Git and repositories, as I'll step you along here, but if you're interested, I have an entire series on Git and Xcode that you might be interested in. So let's open this app now in Xcode 13. And it opens just fine. But I want to make sure that I am on the development branch, so I'll click on the source control menu, and it looks a little different. It now separates changes from the repository. I'll make sure that I'll click on repositories and drop down the hierarchy until I can see both branches, and make sure that I check out the development branch if it's not already checked out. If you open this project again in Xcode 12, once we start adding new features, you'll have to switch branches back to main. However, as soon as we start adding iOS 15 features, you won't be able to access Xcode 12. We'll still maintain a target of 14.5, but from now on you'll have to open this project in Xcode 13 as soon as we start making new additions. If we go to the target once more, I now see for my target deployment that I can go all the way up to 15.0. But if I change this here and update my app and submit it to the App Store, no one running iOS 14 will be able to run the app. So we're going to need to conditionally apply changes within our app itself. So how are we going to do that? Well, a lot of my changes are going to be applied to the list view in Content View. So I want to separate that view off into its own struct and own file. List view starts here and ends at the onAppear. Let's copy this then and create a new SwiftUI file, and I'm going to call it NewsListView. I'm going to remove the preview and replace the text view with what I just copied. There is no view model in the scope, and I don't really need the entire view model. All I need is the articles property from there. So create a new property that we'll call articles that is an array of article view model. Now I can remove the view model designation from the list, and the errors go away. Let's return now then to Content View, and if you're lucky, the text will still be selected. So delete it and replace it with an instance of the news list, passing on the view model articles as the articles parameter. If we refresh the canvas and enter preview mode, we'll see that we still get our news. Now for our first iOS 15 update. Your users won't notice this, but we're going to apply as many iOS 15 features as we can to our app. In iOS 15, when our view loads, instead of using onAppear, we can use a .task. If we do that, however, we get the error that task is only available in iOS 15 or newer, and we never changed our deployment target. So the way we're going to have to do that is conditionally apply this new method. And we can do this with the available directive, or keyword, and specify that we want our task to be applied only if we are in iOS 15 or later. We can't do a conditional on the method though, so we'll enclose the view and the method within that clause. But if our users are still running iOS 14, in that case we'll need to use else and repeat the code, only this time we'll use onAppear. We can test this now and see that our app still runs in the preview, only this time using task, because we're running on an iOS 15 simulator in the preview. Now to be clear, if you open this project now in Xcode 12, you would get errors because Xcode 12 has no idea what task is. I'd have to switch back to the main branch and then work from the main branch. However, if I were to submit this app to the App Store now and iOS 15 was live, it would run on both iOS 14 and iOS 15 devices. Now notice as well that in our project navigator we have an M indicating that files have been modified and an A for that file that we just added. So go to the source control menu and commit the changes to your repository. You'll need to add a comment like enabled task for iOS 15 and then commit the changes. We're going to leave Content View for now and come back to it later. But I want to go now to our new news list view and see if we can make some specific changes just for that view. iOS 15 introduces us to a new struct called AsyncImage. And this view uses the standard URL session instance to load an image from the specified URL and then display it. And this is exactly what we're doing when we present our headline images. Since it is an iOS 15 feature only, we need to make sure that it is available before we can use it. So let's go to the news list view now and where we present our image. And we want to use this code only if iOS 15 is not available. So what we can do is start off with if available iOS 15 or later, else we'll use the old code. Within the iOS 15 code, we only want to use the new async image if our article.image is not nil. Within this iOS 15 code block, we can start by typing async image, and we'll see that we have 6 different options. With the shortest option, until the image loads, the view displays a standard placeholder that fills the available space. And after the load completes successfully, the view updates to display the image. This appears to be what we want, but unfortunately we can't apply image-specific modifiers like the resizable or the aspect ratio to an async image. So let's look at the next option. This second option has a closure that uses an async image phase, and it does produce a modifiable image. But for our purposes, it's a bit of overkill as these are longer options. The one that we want to use is this one. The URL is our URL-to-image property from our original model. However, we have not included that in our view model. So let's quickly return to the article view model and add that now as a computed property, and it will be optional. Let's call it image URL, and we'll just return the article.url-to-image. Back in NewsList then, the URL is optional, so we can use article.imageURL. I will tap Enter on the content closure and see that I will get an image that I will call image. And then I can apply the same modifiers to it as I did with the iOS 14 version. The placeholder closure this provides me with is the ability to present a custom placeholder rather than the default one that the first option did. So I'm just going to use a progress view, that little spinning circle. Let me run this on the simulator now. Initially, when loaded, it seems to load nicely. However, as I scroll, not all the images are loading. I get that constant spinner being displayed and the image never loads. This is a known bug in iOS 15 that is still there in the beta 3 that I'm running. If it's working for you while you're working through this tutorial, the bug must be fixed, so you can just ignore this next part. It's that bug that stops these images from loading, those ones that are off screen, and this shouldn't happen. Now, I posted this question on Twitter, and Paul Colton pointed out that this is an identified bug, and it's noted in the release notes, and he pointed me to a hack that I could apply. The problem was that the hack used the AsyncImage phase version of AsyncImage, and I used the image placeholder version, so I thought it might be worthwhile showing you how I created the hack for this. Feel free to skip over this section if it's working for you, but you might learn something. What I want to do is to create a replacement for AsyncImage that will have exactly the same signature as AsyncImage, but simply keep refreshing until the image is no longer nil. So create a new Swift file and call it AsyncImageList, and change the import to SwiftUI. Now we want to create a view that will use AsyncImage, so we need to specify that this entire struct will be available for iOS 15 and later only. This is not a clause though, so we'll have to use the @available attribute to apply a strict declaration and specify which OS to target. So in our case, we'll want to target iOS 15 and later. So let's create that struct and call it AsyncImageList. If we open the documentation for AsyncImage, we see that it uses a generic content where content is a view. And we want to use one that also gives us a placeholder, which is a view as well. So within my struct, I'm going to create two generics. First one will be content, and the second one will be placeholder, with the restriction that both of them are views. Now, since it's a view, there must be a body of some view. Now we're going to manipulate the async image to fix somehow within the body. So let's type in async image and see that we have those three parameters. This means that when we create our async image list, we must also have those three parameters. First will be URL, and that will be an optional URL. Next, we'll create one for content. That's a closure that has an image argument and returns content view. And for placeholder, it's another closure that returns the placeholder view provided. Now we can simply use those three properties as the arguments for our async image. Now what we want to do, however, is that whenever this async image appears on the screen, meaning specifically those ones that are going to be off screen, we'll need to check if it has stopped loading. And we can do that by creating a temporary state property called current URL, which is another optional URL, and pass it to the async image instead of the URL. And then when the view appears, which is either right at the start or when I scroll the list, we'll check to see if it's nil, which of course it is when it's first loading. And then we'll assign it the real URL, forcing a view refresh. So as soon as our off-screen views appear on the screen, it'll force another loading of the async image. This, of course, all has to be done on the main queue. Now, returning to our news list, we can simply change async image to async image list, as it has exactly the same arguments. Let's test now on the device. All headlines that have an image are loading using our new struct. Now, I'm not suggesting that you use this, as it will be fixed, I'm sure, but you need to give yourself notice that we will need to change this back once it has been fixed. I just thought that this was a useful exercise to go through this process. So make sure you add a warning so that when you see this every time you compile, your app has a warning to check this to see if it's now working, and that we can revert back to the real version. And finally, let's commit those changes to our repo. In the last part of this video, I want to take advantage of the new, long-awaited async await functionality for asynchronous calls. Currently, our getJSON function in our API service uses a callback with a result type. Andy Ibanez describes async await like a hybrid between procedural programming and callback-based closures. Procedural code runs from top to bottom, and control is given back to the caller through a return, whereas callback concurrency will create asynchronous tasks but will continue executing the current thread without an issue even if those tasks are running, and control is given back to the caller through a completion handler. Now, async has three uses: to tell the compiler when a piece of code is asynchronous, and to create a bridge between synchronous and asynchronous code. We'll show an example of this after we write our first async function, and to spawn asynchronous tasks in parallel. Now, there are lots of very good blogs available on this topic, and the one I'm quoting from is the one by Andy Ibanez, and I highly recommend it. So what I want to do is rewrite our getJSON function for iOS 15 using this new functionality. So within our API service, let me start by creating a new function, but first make it available to iOS 15 or later. Now I'm going to use almost exactly the same parameters as the first one of this name, but instead of having a completion handler as one of the parameters, I'll end here, and I'll return t. We need to do one more thing though. We'll need to specify that this return is asynchronous and it can throw an error. Now, as with our original function, we'll need to unwrap URL with a guard statement and also form a request. So let me just copy and paste those from the previous function. However, we don't have a completion of a failure. Instead, we'll throw an error with an API error using the same NS localized string. Next, we're going to use the new async URL session shared data for request function. It's asynchronous. And to use this request, the URL data task delegate is optional, so I'm not going to need that. Now, if we option click and check out the quick help, we'll see that it's asynchronous and possibly throws if there is an error. And it will provide us with data and a URL response as a tuple. So let's assign that to two appropriately named properties. Let data response, that's our tuple, is going to be equal to the URL session.shared.data for the request. Now, I get an error that it's async, but it's not marked with a wait. So let's do that. Then we get an error that says it can throw, but it's not marked with try. So let's do that too. Let's do an actual check to see if the response is an HTTP URL response as it should be. If not, we'll throw another error. Next, we're going to need our decoder along with the date decoding and key decoding strategies. So let's just copy those from above and paste them here. Now that we have the decoder, we can try to decode the data. If try ? does not return an optional, we can use a guard let, passing it on to the decoded data, else we'll throw an error, and that will be an API error, and we'll use the localized string error decoding data. Having reached this far then, we must have decoded the data. So, with it being an asynchronous function, we can return it. In the NewsView model then, we can choose which of these two functions we want to call, if available. If it's not available, we'll run our original code. Then within the iOS 15 block, when we start the same way, we'll choose, instead of a closure, the one that's receiving a news object, and we're going to get it directly. And because the function has a generic type, we'll need to be specific. Now when I try to use APIService.shared, I see that the option I want is grayed out with a warning that says that it is used in a context that does not support concurrency. We can solve this problem at first by saying that we should await for the result using task, which has an optional priority and a closure. So we can ignore the priority and simply write this. When I try it again, it's still grayed out, but let's create it anyway, passing in the constants.endpoint, but also the date decoding strategy of ISO 8601, as we did for the completion handler version. Now this gives us two errors. The expression is async, but not marked with a wait, and it can throw, but is not marked with try. I can fix the await issue by adding await and using try in front in case I throw an error. Now, we may have errors bubbling up from the getJSON function that we need to handle. So let's enclose this within a do catch block and print the localized description if there's an error. We're not doing anything with the news yet, so let's assign the articles property to our articles property that we've created and make sure that we map it to an array of activity view model instead. And then we can set the isLoading property to false. If I run this now, it all loads nicely. However, there's something wrong here, I think. What thread are we on? I can check by printing out the current thread when it gets our news. Let me run once more. The console tells me that I am not running on the main thread. I'm on some background thread and I can't update the UI in the background and not eventually run into some problems. Now, I could do as I did on the other one and enclose these in the dispatch queue.main.async closure. But there's a better way. All I have to do is return to the API service and mark this function as a main actor, because this function needs to be run on the main thread and it's currently running in the background. If I run this once more, we are now on the main thread and our video is complete for now. Let's commit that update now to our repository. In the future, I'll be updating my to-do app that I created for another series, so it will run only on iOS 15. And when we do that, we'll be able to take advantage of some more iOS 15 features and syntax changes that don't make sense here. In the final video of this series, though, I'll be adding 2 new features. One that will be both available to iOS 14 and 15, and that's the ability to choose a different country. And the second will be only a iOS 15 feature that will use the pull to refresh to load and display the remaining articles from the feed. We only currently get the first 20.